Good morning. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and we are so pleased this morning to be able to have the first of a two-part series on ADA and temporary traffic control, building accessible and detectable work zones. And we have with us my colleague from West Virginia, Dr. Ron Eck, who we've had the great fortune of having trained for us in the past. And we are very pleased that he'll be your presenter this morning. A couple housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn things over to him. First off, I'd like for everybody to find the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. And if you wouldn't mind, drop me a hi or hello in there. I want to make sure you know where that's at, because that is how we're going to be accepting questions throughout the webinar today. And periodically, Ron will be stopping to ask me for questions. So if you have questions as he's presenting, please put them in the question box and we'll get to them. The other thing I want to mention is that we do have handouts for you, including a copy of the slides. So those are in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, along with some announcements for upcoming webinars, including another one that we were so fortunate to have Ron agree to provide for us, which is self-evaluations and transition plans and a PROWAG overview. So that's in there, along with some announcements for a restricted crossing U-turn intersection webinar we have coming up with Mark Doctor. We have an ITS webinar series. This is brand new from our Traffic Academy section, and you don't have to actually need the credit for the pre-qualification. If you're just interested in the topic, you're welcome to take it. All of our webinars are free. And then if you have an interest in the real estate area, we have an Acquisition 104 Instruments course coming up. So those announcements are all in the handout section. The last thing I'm going to do before I turn things over to Ron is I'm going to go ahead and run the first poll question. And I'm launching this. And if you wouldn't mind taking a second to give us your response. If you can't get your response to record, you're in full screen mode and you'll just need to hit escape to get out of that. But we'd like to know what your work affiliation is. Are you with a state agency, a local government agency? Are you with the private sector, a utility, or are you educational, federal agency, or other? So pick one of those. And we do have one person with a state agency that put that in the question area. So I'll read that off. And Ron, they're voting very quickly. We're going to be at 80% before you know it, which is good because we've got over 200 people on so far. So, all right, we've gotten over 80%. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll question out and share the responses with everyone. And I'm going to read them off too, because our presenter actually doesn't get to see the responses. So you have on the webinar today, Ron, 43% from local public agencies, 27%, that's a tie, both 27% for state and private. No utilities, but we do have 3% from educational or federal agencies or other. So I'll hide that and they can see your slides now again, Ron, so it's all yours.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm pleased to see such a good turnout for the session today on ADA and temporary traffic control. My background is engineering. I'm a civil engineer, basically a traffic engineer, and for the last few years have had an interest and experience in Americans with Disabilities Act and with PROWAG. And as I traveled around the country, I tended to see sidewalk work areas, in my opinion anyway, were not handled very well. It was sort of like pedestrians would be walking on a sidewalk and come up to a work area, and it was like we were saying, you know, go for it, find your way through here or around here. And of course, that's not a safe or accessible way of doing it. So this course was developed kind of in response to that. It's normally a half-day course when I teach it in person, so you all are getting kind of the condensed version here, or the COVID version, if you will. And let's see, there we go. This is an overview of what we'll talk about today and tomorrow, a little bit of background and introduction. Then we'll discuss the pedestrian access route from PROWAG, for those of you not familiar with that. Then we'll get into the meat of the course, which is accommodating pedestrians and the accessible and detectable pedestrian path. We'll sort of wrap up with some best practices tomorrow, and then also look at some actual temporary traffic control situations where we can kind of critique the setups or the arrangements or lack thereof. Well, let's start with the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. It's probably fitting we're doing this class because, as you can see here in a little more than a month, we'll be at the 30th anniversary of ADA. It is a civil rights law, so it's a little bit different law type, if you will, than maybe those of us in public works are used to dealing with. We may be more familiar with tort law or personal injury law, as it's sometimes called, rather than civil rights law. But basically, ADA says that we have to provide equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities. We can't discriminate against them in terms of access to programs, services, and facilities. And notice the key element there, the next to last bullet, all programs, and when they say programs in ADA, that includes the built infrastructure, sidewalks and crosswalks and signals and so forth. All programs and new and altered facilities, regardless of the funding source, have to be accessible. And I've highlighted altered because I think we'd all agree that if we close a sidewalk for some construction, or if we detour the pedestrians maybe into what had been the parking lane to get around a sidewalk construction area, or if we change the surface of the walking area, that we have altered it. And ADA says those altered facilities have to be accessible. And just something to keep in mind as we go through this, the US DOJ, the Department of Justice, they have the ultimate compliance responsibility. Part of ADA deals with the public right-of-way, and those guidelines are referred to as PROWAG, the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. Those of you that work with ADA, there's also the 2010 ADA Design Standards, which are the current law when it comes to ADA. The issue with those 2010 guidelines, or ADAG as it's also called, is that those are intended for buildings and on-site facilities. They don't really address all the issues in the public right-of-way that we face, like crosswalks or signals. So the US Access Board issued PROWAG to cover or address those issues in the public right-of-way. Notice one thing about PROWAG is it's not yet been signed into law. It's still undergoing the rulemaking process, and we're operating under the 2011 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. But my recommendation, the recommendation of DOJ and the US DOT, and you see their logos there, as well as what the courts are telling us, is that we should be using PROWAG when we're talking about accessibility in the public right-of-way. And so that's the theme of the rest of this session today and tomorrow, is we will be looking at PROWAG. What does PROWAG say about this? Well, notice advisory R302.1, as I just said, indicates temporary routes are alterations to an existing developed pedestrian facility, and so we need to achieve maximum accessibility feasible under existing conditions. And that's sort of the bottom line. I mean, we recognize that whether it's a work zone or not, sometimes we may have a utility pole in the sidewalk or some other situation that we can't comply with the letter of the law, if you will. But the bottom line is what the courts and what DOJ would look at is, have we made the facility accessible to the maximum extent feasible? And there should be documentation to show why we couldn't do it or why it was not feasible to comply with the criteria themselves. So you'll hear me say that many times today, but document, document, document. That's an important part of this process, particularly if it's not feasible to comply with some of the criteria. PROWAG also mentioned something called the alternate pedestrian access route, and I know there's a lot of text here, but notice they say when a pedestrian circulation path, a sidewalk, is temporarily closed for whatever reason, there has to be an alternate pedestrian access route provided. And I won't give you all the citations there from the MUTCD, but the point of this slide, one of them is, notice that we're working with PROWAG, but also we need to rely on Part 6 of the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices as well. So they kind of work together in this area, and I'll be referring to both as we go through the sessions. And of course, those of you familiar with Part 6 of the MUTCD are very familiar with this language. We have to consider all road users, including pedestrians, but also I highlighted, notice, including pedestrians with disabilities, and then the word shall there. Shall be an essential part. So that's just something that's nice to do. It's a mandatory condition under the MUTCD. So we have to accommodate those with disabilities. I apologize for these two awkward pictures, but I really only intended to take one, and then something happened. I ended up taking both. But this is Canal Street in New Orleans. Maybe some of you have been there. This is sort of the heart of the tourist district, I think. You can see some of the high-rise hotels in the background. It's multi-lane street in each direction. You can see there's streetcars in the median. You can see the sidewalks are fairly wide, so there's a lot of pedestrian and motor vehicle traffic in this area. And I was there for a conference a year or so ago and was just walking one morning before the conference started, and I came across this work area, which is, it's not really a road or street project, as it looked to me. It's some sort of building reconstruction project. But notice how they had closed the sidewalk here, just this yellow caution tape, which of course is not detectable by a blind pedestrian using the long cane, as it's called, or the white cane. So I was getting a photograph of that, and as I was doing that, a woman from behind me walked, and she was headed in the direction into the slide, and noticed that the sidewalk was closed, and so she is going around the work area. Now, of course, oftentimes we might use the parking lane here or this lane of traffic, curb lane here, for a pedestrian detour route. But notice there's materials, there's vehicles in both of those lanes. And so there really is no alternate route, such that she will have to walk in a travel lane on Canal Street with her back to traffic. I mean, would we all agree, just from a safety standpoint, that's not good. But imagine someone in a wheelchair, because there's a curb here, someone in a wheelchair can't take the route she took. They would have to turn around and go back to the corner and cross the street at an intersection. Someone who's blind using the cane probably wouldn't realize what was going on until that caution tape kind of got wrapped around their torso, upper torso, and it would take them some time to figure out what was going on. So this is, both from a safety and from an accessibility standpoint, this is not a well done work area at all. But that's sort of the crux of the problem we're talking about. How do we make this detectable and accessible? So what we're going to be talking about today and tomorrow applies to all temporary traffic control zones set up by state or local road agencies, or by construction contractors, maintenance contractors, utility companies, landscape companies, as well as any sidewalk, lane, or road closure for vertical construction activities or building construction activities. And that's what I just showed you there in New Orleans. That was not a road or street project. That was a vertical construction or building construction project, but yet it affected both the sidewalk and the roadway. So you've seen examples of what the scope includes. It could be as simple as a municipality replacing one slab on a residential sidewalk in a neighborhood in town. Could be range all the way up to major construction projects that require closure of lanes or sidewalks, like I showed you on Canal Street. So I mentioned accessible and detectable a number of times. It's in the course title. What do we mean by accessible and detectable? Notice accessible means an alternate pathway through a sidewalk work zone that a pedestrian can safely reach, enter, travel through to the other end of the work activity or work zone. And this implies that there should be a smooth, firm, slip-resistant surface, like the concrete sidewalk we see there, so that someone in a wheelchair or a walker can navigate that surface easily and readily and safely. If the sidewalk crosses an alley or a street or a driveway or something like that within the work area, we may need curb ramps to facilitate the movement of someone in a wheelchair between the sidewalk and the street. And also, if we're requiring that folks have to turn, make a change in direction, there needs to be an appropriately sized and level turning space for them to make those turns. So those are all elements of what we call accessibility. What about detectability? Means it must be detectable by someone with a vision impairment. And notice here in the image, we see this pedestrian is blind from her long cane here. And the way she would navigate is she and others using the cane would swing that cane in an arc in front of them, maybe 3 feet or so in extent. And what they're looking for are what they call shorelines, something they can detect with the cane. In this case, this little concrete wall or raised curb, whatever we want to call it here, that is a shoreline for her. She can detect that with her cane. And so that helps her sort of keep on a straight path as she navigates that block. Down here, out of the view of this image, we can't see it, but is probably a curb along the street or the roadway. Curbs are a good thing for blind pedestrians. They can be detected with the cane. So that would be another shoreline for her as she walks on that sidewalk. But obviously, if I'm in a wheelchair, a curb is not a good thing. It's a barrier that prevents me from moving between the sidewalk and the street. So that's why we have to use curb ramps. So here's some examples I've taken in my travels over the last few years. And I'll raise the question, are they detectable or accessible? Notice here that the actual construction is taking place on the next block down here. There's a side street that comes out. So the actual work is taking place here, but what the project people, the municipality or the contractor wants folks to do is to cross here. And can you see it's starting to get faded and worn, but there is a mid-block crosswalk here, marked crosswalk. But think about that now, if you're blind using a cane, that is not a detectable work area. If I'm blind, I cannot see that sign. So I have no idea that I'm supposed to cross the street mid-block there. I would just keep going. Fortunately here, it doesn't look like there's a serious issue in terms of what we see, but I think there in the distance, the sidewalk may be closed or there may be an excavation or something like that. So we need that. If you want to have a detectable sidewalk closure situation, there'd need to be a detectable barricade across the sidewalk here that can be detected with the cane. But what about accessibility? Well, I don't see a curb ramp here. And also notice this is bare earth, which is not an accessible, it's not a firm, stable surface that complies with PROWAG for wheelchair travel. So I would argue this is neither detectable or accessible. To make this accessible, we need to put in a hard surface curb ramp here connecting the sidewalk with the street. I took this one a few years ago. I won't say where, but I'm an able-bodied sighted pedestrian, and I still wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to do here. Again, imagine you're blind using a cane or maybe have low vision, so your vision is very poor. You have to rely on color contrast and textures and things to navigate. This is not a good situation. To the sighted person, we can see the sidewalks closed, but it appears that the pedestrian here has walked through here to get to the crosswalk. In fact, that's what I did. But if you look closely, this is the access drive to the, and again, this is a vertical construction project. It's not a road or street project, but obviously it's affecting the road and street operation. There's a pipe here, water pipe probably, to allow the vehicles, construction vehicles, to pass over that. They put in some stone here, but that stone has now created a soft surface there, such that that is not accessible by wheelchair travel. So someone in a wheelchair cannot move from this area here, which looks like a transit stop since there's a bench here we can see. But someone in a wheelchair cannot move from this area to the crosswalk. So I would contend this particular corner or this section of sidewalk is neither detectable nor accessible. Then how about this? This is more of a short term. This will probably be just on the order of maybe an hour or two project. Can you see here they've taken the manhole cover off, and I was here for about 15 minutes. There's two individuals down there below grade, and most of the time I was here, the third individual was standing here as a spotter. I don't know what happened, but I turned around and he was gone. So this is not a good situation to have that open side there where someone can walk into that. But this arrangement here of these bars or barricades, that is a detectable device. Personally, I would move it farther from the opening. I think it's too close to the opening, but that would be a detectable device, and there is sufficient width here that someone in a wheelchair or a walker can get through. So this is accessible. It's somewhat detectable. Like I said, I think I want to improve it a little bit. And there should be, this spotter individual should be here to make sure that no one can enter this side of the sidewalk, or also if he or she would see people with vision disabilities or someone with a mobility disability, they can help them get through the area. So I'll stop at this point, maybe, Victoria, and see if there are any questions up to this point.
No questions, Ron.
Okay, that sort of completes the introduction. Now what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the pedestrian access route, or the PAR, from PROWAG. Many of you may be familiar with this already, but for this class, I assume that folks don't necessarily have a background with ADA, and so we'll do a short discussion of what are some of the requirements in terms of width and surface and grade and cross slope that an accessible route needs to have. Since I've been talking about we need to have an accessible alternate route, what are the elements of that accessibility? So that's what we'll look at. And I've given you, those that want to look into this more, I've given you the PROWAG citations here that you can follow up with. First one is width. PROWAG says the minimum continuous unobstructed clear width of the PAR shall be, notice shall be 4 feet measured from the back of the curb. And that means free of temporary and permanent obstructions. I realize some agencies around the country have adopted 5 feet as a minimum, and I think that's great. I think that's the way to go personally. Because if you're 5 feet wide, you don't have to worry about passing spaces. But notice, if your pedestrian access route is less than 5 feet in clear width, then every 200 feet you have to provide 5 foot by 5 foot passing spaces. So my personal recommendation is you use 5 feet as the minimum walkway width. Walkway grade. And here PROWAG and ADAG that I mentioned earlier differ. In the public right-of-way, if the sidewalk is in the right-of-way and serves the road or street or bridge, it can follow the general parallel roadway grade, no matter how steep it is. I'm speaking to you today from Morgantown, West Virginia. We have some streets at one end of our downtown that are probably 25% grade, pretty darn steep, especially if you're trying to go up that in a manual wheelchair or down that in a manual wheelchair. But those sidewalks follow the street, they're right behind the curb. And so under PROWAG, those sidewalks at 26% or 25%, those are not out of compliance with PROWAG. But otherwise, if you have some sort of walkway that doesn't serve the street, then the maximum grade is 5%. And likewise, we should also keep in mind that means that the crosswalk grade. The maximum grade of a crosswalk, that is the street crown, is 5%. One of the big challenges with PROWAG generally, not only in work zones, but just generally, is cross slope. PROWAG says the cross slope of the walkway of the PAR shall be 2% maximum. And there's no allowance for construction tolerance. So if your contractor or your builders say the best we can do is plus or minus 0.5%, then we should be designing for 1.5%, so that when they're built, the sidewalks won't exceed 2%. And the reason for that strict requirement is shown here on the image on the left side of the slide. If we could get in a drone or something, get up above someone in a manual wheelchair, moving along a steeply cross-sloped sidewalk, we would see that their path is not straight. It's very irregular. They're trying to keep a straight path, but there's a lot of sort of back and forth motion. It takes a lot of extra energy. It's been said that for a 3% cross slope, that's only 1% more than the maximum, someone in a manual wheelchair expends 50% more energy than they would on a 2% cross slope. And if you ever get a chance to get in a manual wheelchair, I'd encourage you to check that out for yourself. You'll probably see the biggest thing you'll notice if you're not familiar with a manual wheelchair once you get in it is the effect of cross slope. So here's a potential cross slope solution, just one of maybe many that might be used. But notice we have a level area, say 4, 5, 6 feet wide of 2% cross slope. The rest of the walkway can be steeper than that. And of course, that does present issues for other users, for able-bodied users, may present maintenance issues, what have you, but this would comply with PROWAG. PROWAG's pretty general when it comes to surfaces. Basically, they say that surfaces must be firm, stable, and slip resistant, and they should be smooth. One thing that you'll hear if you talk to individuals in wheelchairs who have suffered severe spinal cord injuries, they will tell you that a rough surface like paver block or brick or certain joints, that rough surface creates vibrations that are excruciatingly painful. So my advice is to make the actual travel way a smooth surface. PROWAG also addresses vertical surface discontinuities, or changes in level as it's sometimes called. And notice these cannot exceed a 1/4 inch maximum. Think about that, that's not very much. Those between a 1/4 and a 1/2 inch need to be beveled with a slope not steeper than 50% across the entire vertical surface discontinuity. So that's what we're showing over here. And of course, this could be done by grinding down, say, the higher elevation with a grinder device, or we could put in a wedge of concrete to create that ramped or beveled surface. Regarding surface, we also need to pay attention to horizontal openings like joints and grates. PROWAG says the openings shall not permit passage of a sphere more than a 1/2 inch in diameter. And you can see here an example, the small front wheels of that wheelchair have gone into that grate. The chair will come to an abrupt stop, and it could actually catapult the person in the chair out of the chair onto the sidewalk where they could be seriously injured. Or grates like that affect people with walkers or crutches or braces. It affects the bearing and stability of those crutch tips or cane tips. Also wanted to mention protruding objects, which are quite common in our built environment. A protruding object is defined as something that protrudes more than 4 inches into the pedestrian walking space at a height more than 27 inches, but less than 80 inches. And that 27 inches comes from use of the cane. If something is 27 inches or lower, I can detect it with my long cane. If it's higher than 27 inches, I'm going to run into it before I detect it. And a good example of that is this tape here. I'm going to run into that caution tape before I detect it with my cane. But what I really wanted to show in this slide is notice this vertical tubing here on the scaffolding. It's more than 27 inches above the pavement. It extends more than 4 inches off of this vertical element. And so that is a protruding object. Somebody can run into that. Other protruding objects that we have are things like fire department connections, signs, tree limbs, pole-mounted signal controller boxes. All those sorts of things are protruding objects. So in our alternate route, we need to be aware of that because the alternate route needs to be free of protruding objects. Another one would be hanging flower baskets, that sort of thing, because they do represent a safety hazard to all pedestrians, but particularly to the visually impaired who may not see a tree limb in front of them or some other object. And this is just for your reference. It shows kind of the diagram of what is a protruding object. So protruding object would be anything that extends more than 4 inches into the space defined by these red dashed lines here. Notice we're saying this is 4 inches, so this is not a protruding object, but if it was say 5 inches or 6 inches, that would be a protruding object. This is not a protruding object. It's more than 4 inches, but it's higher than 80 inches. So most of us would be able to walk under that. This might be a pole-mounted signal controller box, but notice much of it here is lower than 27 inches, so that would be detected by the cane. And I should note this requirement applies over the full width of the walkway, not just 4 or 5 feet. This applies over the full width of the walkway. Curb ramps are important for moving between the sidewalk and the street. This just shows the components of the curb ramp. The ramp itself is this larger rectangle here in the center of the slide. And the street is running right to left or left to right at the bottom of the slide. And this area here is a sidewalk, so pedestrians are walking back and forth or left to right here. So this is our ramp. The gray area is the detectable warning surface on the ramp or at the base of the ramp. At the top of the ramp, we should have a level turning space for folks to turn. And then since this is in a pedestrian circulation area, we need to have flared sides. I mentioned the detectable warning surfaces, the truncated domes. They are at the base of the ramp to provide a visual by their color contrast. Here you see bright yellow on the grayish concrete, and they also provide a tactile. By tactile, we mean it can be detected with the cane, as you see here, but I'm not sure I mentioned it enough, but I mentioned there are folks who suffer from low vision, meaning they can see colors and shapes and contrast, but they can't see detail. People with low vision typically do not use a cane. So the way they would detect these is underfoot. So in that sense, tactile means when someone steps on that surface with their footwear, whether it's a shoe or a boot or whatever, they can detect that surface. And you probably see it well here on the left image. So detectable warnings, I want to emphasize, they are a hazard alerting mechanism. There's no directionality or wayfinding associated with them. They're a hazard alerting mechanism. And at orientation and mobility training, which is where a blind pedestrian would go before they start going out navigating the streets, they call it O&M school. At O&M school, they would be taught that when they encounter this surface, either underfoot or with their cane, they are to stop and check out the surroundings before they proceed, because basically this means they're at a street crossing. And the way they check out their surroundings would be, if there's no signal there, would be to listen for traffic flow to see whether the street they're about to cross, has that flow stopped or is it moving. And the rule of thumb for detectable warnings is use them everywhere the curb is missing at a street crossing. So notice this is a street crossing, and where the curb is missing here, we have a detectable warning surface. Just wanted to note there's 3 types of sidewalk to street transitions. There's 2 types of curb ramps, perpendicular or parallel, and also something called a blended transition. In the half-day version of this class, we spend some time looking at these different types of curb ramps and the requirements. In this kind of condensed online version, we don't have time to do that, but I'll put in a plug for the session, I think that starts next week, on self-evaluation plans and overview of PROWAG. We will go into more detail on the different types of curb ramps and curb ramp requirements if anyone's interested in that particular subject. So I think at this point, I'll stop again and ask if anyone has questions up to this point. Anything come in, Victoria?
Yes, I've got a list of them for you.
Oh boy.
So the first two I'm going to kind of bundle together. The individual stated that ADAG is law, but deals primarily with buildings and leaves a lot of gaps. They want to know if the gaps are filled with PROWAG, but they also wanted to confirm that PROWAG is currently not law, but a standard of practice, correct?
Yeah, I should have said this at the start, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'll come back and answer it. But one of the things with ADA generally, and those of you that work with ADA are well aware of this, is that ADA is very context sensitive. So what might apply in one case or work in one case, even in one city, might not work on the other side of town because of different topography, different utilities, different right-of-way, that sort of thing. So oftentimes the answer to these questions is it depends. And again, I'm not trying to be a wise guy or put anybody down, but sometimes the answer is it depends. And the answer to that question about PROWAG is it depends. It's correct that PROWAG has not been signed into law, whereas ADAG has. So ADAG is law. But there are some state and local agencies around the country that have adopted PROWAG. So in those entities, PROWAG is the criteria we need to follow. And also, as I think I mentioned earlier, DOJ and the courts, through their rulings, are telling us that they consider PROWAG, if not law, it's the best available guidance to provide accessibility in the public right-of-way. And remember, I mentioned at the outset, sort of the bottom line is those of us in public entities have to make sure our facilities are accessible to the maximum extent feasible. And if the best guideline that's available for something is PROWAG, then we should be following PROWAG. The other thing I think I maybe should mention is that, forget how you worded that, Victoria, but something about can PROWAG fill in the gaps? There you have to be careful. But an entity could use ADAG for its public right-of-way. An entity could choose to do that. But if they choose to do that, they have to use ADAG in its entirety. So for example, in ADAG, the minimum, in ADAG, the design user is someone in a wheelchair. So the minimum width of a access route in ADAG is 3 feet. I've heard some agencies say, well, we're going to use ADAG because that way we can get by with 3-foot wide sidewalks. Well, the problem with that is if you look at ADAG's gradient requirements, ADAG says the maximum grade of an accessible route is 5%. That means if you adopt ADAG in your community, you can't have a sidewalk or a ramp steeper than 5%. So if you adopt ADAG for your public right-of-way, you need to adopt it in full. An agency can't just sort of cherry pick from ADAG and from PROWAG in what works in a particular case. You really have to adopt it one or the other sort of in full, if you will. So I hope that clarifies the situation.
If it doesn't, they can put another comment in the question box. So next question, how is slip resistance measured?
That's a good question. I think at one point in an early version of, I'm not sure if it was PROWAG or ADAG, I think there was an actual sort of minimum coefficient of friction given. That has since been removed. And at this point, my understanding is it's just one of the subjective areas. The other thing I maybe should have mentioned is that there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to ADAG and PROWAG. And I know that's very frustrating to engineers and technicians and other technical type folks because we'd rather have something kind of 0 or 1 or black or white or whatever, but there are a lot of different gray areas, and that is one of them. And my understanding that right now, I guess the slip resistance is one of those subjective areas.
Okay, I'm going to keep reading them, and when you need to move on, you tell me. How would a protruding object be made detectable and not a tripping hazard?
Good question. And again, it depends, but just to give you an example, say from my state, and hopefully everybody can sort of visualize this, we have a lot of pole-mounted traffic signal controller boxes. And in a number of cases, and they're usually the state DOT's controller boxes, what the DOT has been doing the last few years is going around and underneath those controller boxes, the same footprint as the controller box, they are putting, say, a 4 or 5 inch high curb under the controller box, and that makes it detectable. Someone with a cane will hit that curb and realize they can't proceed any further. And there's probably other examples, but one thing I would say too, it doesn't help accessibility, but it does help maybe safety and minimize your risk exposure from a tort claim or something, is in the interim somehow through, could be bright colored paint or warning signs or something, but let people know and make it more visible than it otherwise would be. And I appreciate that doesn't help someone who's blind, but that would at least help the sighted pedestrians, and it might reduce your risk exposure, because at least you're warning pedestrians about it, sighted pedestrians, until you can take care of the issue. Maybe should we go on at this point?
Sure.
Hopefully we'll have time
That's
to.
fine. And I'll save these questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. I hate to discourage them, but we probably should move on.
Sure.
Well, now let's get into the main topic of our session, which is how do we accommodate pedestrians in work areas? It's important, I think, to look at what type of work are you performing? What's the duration? Is it going to be a few hours or a day or a few days or a few weeks or maybe months for a bigger project? And then think about what hazards and impediments will that work create for pedestrians. So notice that not only impediments would relate to accessibility, but hazards relate to safety. We have to consider both. So what if you have a work zone where your crews are going to be present and the work will last only a few hours? Remember that slide I showed you of the manhole, open manhole cover, where there's a crew down there working? They're probably only going to be there for, I don't know, an hour or 2 or 3, and there'll always be someone present at the surface, hopefully. My slide didn't show that, but there should be. So in that case, I would say, before you start work, determine how pedestrians might be affected by that work activity. And then establish a plan of how the crew is going to assist any pedestrians, especially those with vision or mobility disabilities, help them or assist them in negotiating the work zone. And then identify somebody on the crew to watch for pedestrians, all pedestrians, particularly those with impairments or disabilities, and then initiate the plan if the need arises. And remember that someone you identify should not be the flagger. Flaggers, in my opinion, have enough to do. They shouldn't be also given this responsibility. So it should be someone other than a flagger who also, depending on what they're doing, they should have the ability to be able to watch for pedestrians and initiate the plan. Obviously, you couldn't see them in the slide I showed you earlier, but the 2 people who I told you were down below street level in that manhole, obviously you can't have them watching for pedestrians because they can't see anything on the sidewalk. But what if that temporary traffic control zone is left in place, say overnight, for several days or several weeks, or doesn't have workers present at all times? Then we're going to need more extensive efforts to accommodate pedestrians. And that's what we're going to be talking about, is how do we do that? And remember, the pedestrians need to be accommodated throughout the entire temporary traffic control zone. So let's look at some approaches to routing pedestrians. But remember, I think first and foremost consideration for all pedestrians is safety. And to me, safety and accessibility are not the same thing. PROWAG is an accessibility standard. It's not a safety standard. It's up to us to build in the safety in these projects and activities based on our education, our training, our knowledge, our experience. Just 2 weeks ago, I was reading a report by an engineer. I couldn't believe it. In this report was a statement, this sidewalk is accessible, therefore it's safe. Well, that's not necessarily true. Just because something is accessible doesn't mean that it's safe. So that's why I added this slide here. Safety, to me, is most important. I think even DOJ would agree that safety sort of trumps accessibility. Safety is very important. So there's 3 different ways we could deal with these situations. Excuse me. We could maintain the existing walkway if the sidewalk remains open during construction. Maybe it's shifted to the other side of a wide sidewalk, or maybe it's narrowed a little bit, or maybe the surface type changed, but maybe we can use the existing pathway, and that would be the desirable thing. If we can't do that, can we develop an alternate pathway that's parallel to and easily reached from the current pathway, like maybe detouring pedestrians into what had been the parking lane along the curb? And if we can't do that, maybe we need to think about some sort of a detour, which may involve crossing the street and using the sidewalk on the other side of the street, or maybe even something more elaborate than that. But these are the 3 approaches to think about. We maintain accessibility on the current pathway. The MUTCD says that these temporary facilities have to include the accessibility features consistent with those on the existing facility. So if it's a concrete sidewalk, the temporary facility doesn't necessarily have to be concrete, but it needs to be firm, stable, and slip resistant, and have sufficient width and appropriate cross slope. And in addition, I'll add my safety things here. You know, if you have trenches or holes or equipment that somebody can go in, walk into, or strike against or something, we need to protect pedestrians from that. And the barricades that we use have to be detectable and continuous. Make sure pedestrians can't walk into the workspace. Make sure you have good sight lines at intersections, so sighted pedestrians can check for traffic, but also drivers can see pedestrians. Maybe there's visually impaired pedestrians. We need to make sure drivers can see them. And if you're in say in a commercial district, you know, downtown or something, where you have bus stops, transit stops, business entrances, you need to make sure that you provide access to those. So the alternate pedestrian access route from PROWAG, I think I mentioned that earlier, it indicates that the route shall be on the same side of the street as the disrupted route to the maximum extent feasible. We can't always do that, though, we realize that. Where pedestrians are exposed to construction or traffic, notice they shall be protected with a barricade or channelization device. And we'll talk about that here as we move on, either today or next time. So that's what PROWAG says. Some considerations in creating an accessible alternate route: look at the environment. What pedestrian generators are around? You know, schools, or the library, the courthouse, city hall, shopping district, senior high-rise housing building, or something like that. Do you have significant generators of pedestrian traffic? Then look at the traffic characteristics in the area: speeds, volumes, turning movement volumes, traffic mix, trucks and buses in the traffic stream. And as I mentioned, also access to business and transit. Both PROWAG and the MUTCD address this, and desirably, we'd like to keep pedestrians on the same side of the street, because crossing the street not only does it mean additional distance, but there's the potential of exposure to moving traffic, which brings about the risk of a crash, pedestrian vehicle crash. So in my mind, these are the components of an accessible, detectable temporary path. And actually, we'll, over the next, what's left today and next time, we will talk about these in more detail. But there should be detectable edging. If the path changes or deviates, the pedestrian should be able to detect the edge. We need channelizing devices to channelize the pedestrian. Need to pay attention to the pathway width and the surface condition. We may need to put in temporary ramps, temporary curb ramps. There may be sidewalk closures. How do we handle that? And then what about audible devices that the visually impaired can rely on to get information audibly, since they can't read signs, for example? So let's look at edging first. But before we do that, I want to mention that we should not be using this tape or rope or plastic chain strung between various devices. They're simply not detectable, and they do not comply with ADAG or PROWAG. But yet, as I noted, you see this around the country quite a bit. But these are not appropriate devices. What about detectable edging for pedestrians? Need to provide it throughout the length of the facility, where you may be detouring pedestrians, or maybe the route narrows or something like that. And a key provision is they need to protrude at least 6 inches above the walking surface, and with the bottom of that edging a maximum of 2.5 inches above the surface. And they need to be firmly attached to the ground or some other device. So in other words, they should not move. Also, they should be orange, white, or yellow to match the color of the adjacent channelizing devices or traffic control devices, if those are present. Some examples, it could be prefabricated lightweight sections of plastic or metal that are connected and form an edge. Could be sections of lumber that are interconnected and attached or fixed in place to form that edge. Could be formed in place asphalt or concrete curb. That would be detectable edging. Or chain link or other fencing that has a continuous bottom rail. So here's a couple examples. How about the one on the left here first? Let's say this is 5 feet from the hedge or the landscaping here to the barrier. And let's assume this is a 6 foot or 6 inch high piece of lumber here. I would say that seems to comply with the edging requirements. We have 6 inches, assuming these are attached. It's not clear that these are attached or fastened, but assuming they're fastened to the surface and interconnected, that would be an appropriate edging or barricade. One thing to be careful about with this netting here is that if that becomes kind of loose and starts to sag, a cane can get caught in there, and that can be an issue. So if you're going to use that, make sure that you check the tension or the tautness of that netting. Then how about this one here on the right? We have a wall here. This does not appear to be 6 inches in height. So to me, that is not an appropriate pedestrian edge. If that was 6 inches or 8 inches, that would be. And let's imagine, let's say it's 8 inches high. This is a good example of what I was talking about. That would comply with PROWAG in that you have a detectable edge here, you have a top rail, but would we agree that that's not good construction safety practice? A child or anybody could get into that work area. There's no separation of the work operation from pedestrians. So that's a good example of, if this was 6 or 8 inches, that might comply with PROWAG, but doesn't comply with good construction safety practices. So channelizing devices. Victoria, I'm wondering, maybe we should stop here and take questions, since we have about 5 minutes left or so.
Sure. And then we could just pick back up there on Thursday.
Yeah, we'll pick back up here tomorrow.
Oh, I'm sorry, tomorrow. You're right. All right. Next question that was on the list, are DWS required at bike ramps?
That's a good question too. And I would say, and I assume you're talking about like at roundabouts, the bike ramps at roundabouts that we commonly see. I would say no, because that could be potentially confusing to the visually impaired, that they think they are at a legitimate like crosswalk or crossing point of a roadway when actually they're not. They're just at the foot of the bike ramp. I would say there, and I don't have really examples handy, but let me make a note to try to find some maybe. But what I would say is see if there's some way that you could try to design the bike ramp such that it's unlikely that someone, where the bike ramp intersects the sidewalk, such that it's unlikely that someone who's blind would kind of inadvertently wander down the bike ramp. But that is an issue, and I'll try to find some examples of that, of a way of doing that. Good question.
Good. All right, next question. Do we need detectable warnings at driveways where apron is curbed and there is a drop-off? What about if there is no drop-off?
That's another very good question. And I apologize, but the answer there is it depends. If you recall my general rule of thumb earlier, I said use detectable warnings anywhere the curb is missing at a street crossing. So the way I would look at that is, does the driveway look or act like a street? If the driveway looks or acts like a street, then I would put detectable warnings. If it doesn't, then I would leave them out. Let me give maybe a couple of extreme examples. I know there's a big gray area in between, but for example, the driveway to a single family residential home. I would argue a driveway for a single family home doesn't look or act like a street, so I would not put detectable warnings there. At the other extreme, we might have a private driveway that serves the regional shopping mall, and it's probably multi-lanes wide, right? Probably maybe has dual left turn lanes, maybe right turn lanes, through lanes, probably has a median in the center with the big mall sign, probably is traffic signal controlled. That's a private driveway, but that looks and acts like a street. So I would put detectable warnings where the sidewalk crosses that street. And I realize there's a bunch of examples in between, but the things I would look at in making that decision are sight distance. Can drivers see pedestrians? The curb radius. If it's a large curb radius where traffic can kind of fly around the corner, I'd probably put detectable warnings where I might not if it was a tighter radius. I'd look at traffic volume, both ADT and peak hour volume. I'd probably also look at traffic control. I know some agencies have a policy that if there's a signal or a stop sign or a yield sign on the driveway, that is the trigger that they will install detectable warnings. But if someone has additional questions about that, well, two things. One, we will talk about this in a fair amount of detail next week in the PROWAG overview part of that class, but also feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is on the first slide, and I'll be glad to discuss that with you further. But a key conclusion is that, and I know designers don't like to hear this, but you really need to look at each driveway because each driveway is different. Even if you have 2 or 3 driveways that serve the same, say, fast food restaurant, each of those driveways is different probably in terms of its width, traffic volume, radius, and so forth. So you really have to look at each driveway individually.
Well, Ron, that takes us up to 1 minute before 11. So I'm going to go ahead and call it there. We want to thank you very much for your time this morning. And I am going to send you the rest of the questions that are in the question box so you can look those over before tomorrow.
Okay.
For everybody who's on the webinar, there's a couple of people who commented that they needed the information to register for tomorrow's part 2. So I'll be sending that out to everyone who's on here, along with a link to the flyer to register for next week if you're interested in the self-evaluation transition plans course. So thank you again, Ron, for your time this morning, and thank you to everyone who joined us. And we will look forward to talking with everyone tomorrow morning. Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for the great questions. See everyone tomorrow.
Thanks.